This story ends with a man investigators never seriously questioned. He lived another 36 years after he did it. He built a life. He grew old. Investigators did not even learn who he was until 5 years after he had already died. For now, his name does not matter. Because for 36 years, nobody knew it either. This is not really a story about a murder. It is a story about a question, one that sits underneath everything that happens next. What happens when investigators stop looking for the truth and start looking for confirmation instead? Today we're covering the Christine Jessop case, one that led to one of Canada's most notorious wrongful convictions before DNA finally revealed the truth decades later. If you're new here, consider subscribing. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Christine Marion Jessop was 9 years old. Born on November 29, 1974, she grew up in Queensville, Ontario, a small community north of Toronto, where everyone recognized everyone else's car in the driveway, where doors were left unlocked, where children were sent outside after breakfast and trusted to make their own way home before the streetlights came on. Nothing had ever happened there to make anyone question that trust. Christine loved school. She loved sports. She had an older brother, Kenneth, and parents, Janet and Bob, who by every account adored her. On the afternoon of October 3, 1984, Christine's school day ended the way it always did. The bus pulled away from the schoolyard, filled with the ordinary noise of children heading home, and somewhere in that noise was a 9-year-old girl holding a plastic recorder her music teacher had handed out that day, turning it over in her hands the way children do with something new. Something that felt, for a few hours at least, like the most important object in the world. At roughly 3:50, the bus stopped on Leslie Street, just north of the main intersection in town, and Christine stepped off, alone, into an afternoon that looked exactly like every other afternoon that had ever come before it. She had somewhere to be, after a stop at home to drop her bag and a stop at the corner store. Her classmate, Leslie Chipman, was waiting for her at the park near the corner store, the two of them having planned to meet around 4 o'clock, the way children plan things, casually, certain that the plan would simply happen because it always did. Christine's father was in jail that day, serving a sentence, and the rest of the family had gone to visit him, leaving Christine home alone for a short, unremarkable window of time. Nothing about that plan asked for anything more than an ordinary afternoon. A walk. A friend. A recorder tucked under one arm. Leslie waited at the park. Minutes passed. She watched the corner where Christine should have appeared, expecting her to come around at any second. Backpack bouncing. Recorder in hand. The corner stayed empty. The light shifted the way it does in early October, that particular gold that comes right before dusk, and still no Christine. Leslie eventually went home. It would be a long time before Leslie, or anyone else in Queensville, understood what that ordinary, unremarkable wait by the swings had actually meant. Janet Jessop and her son, Kenneth, returned home after visiting Bob Jessop in jail, expecting to find Christine there, the television on, homework half done, the ordinary chaos of an evening beginning. Instead, they found an empty house. At first it was nothing. Children lose track of time. Children stop to talk to a neighbor or get distracted by something on the walk home, and turn up minutes later, mildly sheepish, unaware they had caused any worry at all. Janet waited. She called Christine's name from the front step, the way you call a child in from outside, expecting an answer to come back from somewhere close. Nothing came back. The first phone calls went out to neighbors, casual at first, a mother checking whether anyone had seen her daughter, whether Christine had wandered into someone's yard or stopped to play with another child on the street. Each call came back the same way. No, she was not there. No, nobody had seen her since the bus. The casual concern in Janet's voice sharpened with every call, and by the time the sun had fully gone down, what had started as a mother checking in with neighbors had become something else entirely, something with real weight behind it, something that pulled Kenneth Jessop out into the street with a flashlight before anyone had formally decided to start searching. Word moved through Queensville the way it does in a small town, fast, and by nightfall neighbors were already knocking on doors, already pulling on jackets, already fanning out into yards and fields with flashlights sweeping low across the grass. Police arrived, and began their own canvass, going door to door along Leslie Street and the surrounding blocks, asking the same questions Janet had already asked, getting the same answers. Volunteers walked the fields in loose lines, shoulder to shoulder, calling Christine's name into the dark, pausing every few dozen steps to listen for anything that might come back. Nothing did. What happens when a child simply disappears from a town where nothing like that has ever happened before? The town does not know how to hold it. Queensville spent that first night in a state that had no name yet, not grief, because nobody was ready to call it that, but something adjacent to it, a communal holding of breath that would not fully release for months, a feeling that settled over the whole town and did not lift even after the search parties eventually stood down for the night. The search that began that night did not end with the sunrise. It became the shape of the following weeks. Volunteers returned each morning, walking the same fields again in case anything had been missed in the dark, checking ditches, sheds, the edges of wooded lots that bordered the town. Posters with Christine's photograph went up in store windows and on utility poles, her face looking out from behind sheets of laminated paper in a way that made the whole town flinch a little every time they passed one. Local television crews came through, then crews from further afield, until Christine's photograph had traveled well beyond Queensville, reaching newspapers and broadcasts across the region, her face becoming, without anyone asking for it, one of the most recognized in the country that autumn. Janet and her son Kenneth kept hoping in the specific, exhausting way families hope when there is nothing else available to them. They gave interviews. They walked the search lines themselves, day after day, even as the days grew shorter and colder. Even as October gave way to November and the leaves that had covered the ground the day Christine disappeared began to rot into the mud beneath fresh searchers' boots. They answered the same questions from reporters again and again, the same hopeful, careful language every time, because saying anything else out loud felt like giving up on a version of the story none of them were ready to let go of yet. Morale in the search parties, which had been fierce and immediate in the first week, began to fray as the weeks accumulated with nothing to show for them. Volunteers who had shown up every single day started showing up every other day, then once a week. Not because they had stopped caring, but because a body cannot sustain that kind of vigilance indefinitely, and hope, stretched far enough, starts to feel like something closer to grief that has not yet been allowed to happen. Parents in Queensville stopped letting their own children walk home alone. Doors that had never been locked in the entire history of some of these households started getting locked every single night. An entire community's sense of safety collapsed in the space of one afternoon and did not come back. Not that autumn, not for a long time afterward. Christmas came to Queensville that year without its usual wait. Families put up trees and strung lights along their porches the way they always did, but the search continued in smaller, quieter ways through the holidays. Neighbors still checking in, still hoping for news that never came. November became December, and Queensville learned to live inside a particular kind of suspended dread, the specific agony of not knowing, which is very often worse than knowing the worst, because not knowing leaves a door open that the mind cannot stop walking back through. On December 31st, 1984, 3 months after she disappeared, that door closed. Christine's body was discovered at the edge of a farmer's field near Sunderland, roughly 50 kilometers from where she had last been seen, in a place no searchline had ever reached, well outside the radius anyone had thought to look. She had been stabbed. There was evidence of sexual assault. After 3 months, investigators finally had a crime scene. The decisions that followed would define the rest of the case. The investigation never recovered from the first one. Not because there was no evidence left to find, but because the second something looked like a solution, no one in that department wanted to go looking for a better one. Instead of building a case on physical evidence, investigators built one on an impression. On February 14, 1985, Janet Jessop, describing the people in her daughter's world to police, mentioned a neighbor she found strange. Guy Paul Morin, 25 years old, lived next door, worked at a furniture factory, played the clarinet, no record, no history of violence. No real connection to Christine beyond geography and a single word a grieving mother used to describe him. That was enough. Surveillance began 5 days later. Officers interviewed him on February 22nd, and once investigators settled on him, they stopped meaningfully looking anywhere else. While detectives watched Guy Paul Morin's house, the real killer went to work the next morning, as though nothing had happened. Morin was arrested on April 22, 1985, and charged with first-degree murder. His first trial opened in January of 1986, in a courtroom that filled steadily with reporters as the weeks went on, the case having become, by then, one of the most closely watched in the province. Morin sat through testimony day after day, a young man with no history of violence listening to a case built almost entirely on circumstance and suspicion, his own life narrated back to him by strangers, deciding what it meant. The Crown's case rested on thin threads. On February 7th, a jury agreed those threads did not hold, and acquitted him. He walked out of that courtroom a free man, into a scrum of reporters and cameras that had gathered outside, expecting, by then, almost anything but an acquittal. For a moment, it looked like the system had caught its own mistake before real damage was done. It had not. The Crown appealed the acquittal, fought the case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and in 1988 won the right to try him again, dragging a man who had already been cleared once back into a courtroom to answer for a crime a jury had already said he did not commit. The second trial opened in Windsor, Ontario, in May of 1990, moved there in search of a jury untouched by years of local headlines, and it settled into a rhythm that would stretch on for 9 months, becoming, at the time, the longest murder trial in Canadian history. The atmosphere inside that courtroom was different the second time around. Heavier, more procedural, the kind of exhaustive legal grind that comes from both sides knowing exactly how much was riding on the outcome. Where the first trial had moved relatively quickly, weeks rather than months, the second trial crawled, session after session of expert testimony and cross-examination stretching from spring into the following winter, long enough that reporters covering it settled into a kind of grim routine, filing updates on a case that seemed to have no natural endpoint. Morin's parents sat through session after session, watching their son's fate get argued over month after month by lawyers on both sides, watching forensic experts describe hair comparisons in language that sounded, to anyone without a science background, indistinguishable from certainty. It was not certainty. It only sounded like it. Jailhouse informants took the stand and described a confession that fit exactly what prosecutors needed to hear. Men who had every reason in the world to say whatever might shorten their own sentences. The defense argued that investigators had locked onto Morin so early they never seriously considered anyone else, including people with far closer ties to Christine than a neighbor her mother once called odd. None of it mattered. When the verdict was finally read on July 30th, 1992, the courtroom went still, in the particular way courtrooms go still, right before a verdict lands, and then Guy Paul Morin heard the word guilty attached to his name for a murder he did not commit. He was sentenced to life and taken to Kingston Penitentiary. Somewhere else in Ontario, at that exact same moment, the man who actually killed Christine read about the verdict like everyone else. A jury had already told this system it had the wrong man. The system built a second, weaker case out of overstated science and paid testimony, and used it to bury that verdict entirely. Outside the courthouse in Windsor, the case had become something closer to spectacle by the time the second trial reached its final weeks. Television vans parked along the street for weeks at a stretch, reporters trading updates with each other in the hallway during recesses, the whole apparatus of national attention pressing down on a single family's private tragedy. It took DNA, not a detective, to undo what years of tunnel vision had built. Morin was released on bail in February of 1993, walking free, while the country still believed, on paper, he was a child killer. Then, in January of 1995, testing on semen recovered from Christine's underwear excluded him completely. It never had been him. The Ontario Court of Appeal acquitted him for good. His lawyer, James Lockyer, who had spent years fighting to prove what should have been obvious from the beginning, was finally right. 10 years, 2 trials, 18 months behind bars. All of it built on a passing comment and a police force too committed to its own theory to ever ask if it was wrong. What happens when an entire investigation gets picked apart in public, piece by piece? The Kaufman Commission was ordered in June of 1996, with hearings beginning the following February under Justice Fred Kaufman. And it did not simply list what had gone wrong. It traced how each failure fed directly into the next. Tunnel vision closed every other door the moment investigators settled on Morin, meaning no other suspect was ever seriously pursued once his name entered the file. Hair and fiber comparison sounded scientific enough to convince a jury, dressed up in the language of certainty, when the underlying methodology could not reliably support that certainty at all. And jailhouse informants, men with every incentive to tell prosecutors whatever they wanted to hear, supplied the testimony that conveniently filled the exact gaps the Crown's case needed filled. It was not one corrupt investigator making one obviously bad decision. It was an ordinary process, followed step by step, until it produced a wrongful conviction almost by momentum alone. While lawyers debated procedures and forensic standards in front of the commission, Guy Paul Morin was trying to rebuild a life that no longer resembled the one he had lost, a decade behind everyone he had known before his arrest. Still carrying a public reputation the two trials had built around him, whether he deserved it or not. Ontario ultimately paid Morin $1.25 million in compensation, because there was no other way to apologize for a stolen decade. The Commission's findings went on to change how Canadian courts treat forensic hair evidence and jailhouse testimony to this day, a legacy built entirely on the destruction of an innocent man. And while all of that was happening, while a public inquiry spent years cataloging every failure of the investigation, the real killer was still out there, not surveilled, not questioned, not a name on anyone's list, simply living his life while the system's full weight came down somewhere else. Then, for 25 years, the case simply went quiet. It became the quiet architecture of the rest of their lives. Janet and Bob Jessop grew older without an answer, the way parents do when grief never gets to close, marking birthdays that Christine should have had, watching the calendar turn every October 3rd and every December 31st, each date arriving with its own particular weight. Anniversaries of her disappearance passed in the newspapers for a few years, generating a short article, a brief renewal of public attention, and then fading again as the world moved on to other things, the way it always does, leaving the family to carry what the headlines had set down. The investigation changed hands over the years, moving from Durham Regional Police to Toronto Police in the mid-1990s. Detectives periodically reviewed the evidence, hoping advances in forensic science would eventually produce an answer earlier investigators could not. For a long stretch, those techniques did not exist yet. DNA testing, which had already exonerated Morin, could tell investigators who a sample did not belong to. It could not yet tell them who it did belong to, not without a suspect to compare it against, and there was no suspect. Hope in the case rose every so often, whenever a new forensic advance made headlines elsewhere in the world, and fell again just as often, when that advance turned out not to apply here. There were years in that stretch when the case barely surfaced at all, when Christine's name appeared only in passing references to the Morin exoneration rather than as a case anyone was actively working, a cold file among countless other cold files, waiting on a shelf for a technology that had not been invented yet. The biological evidence collected in 1984 remained preserved for decades, waiting for forensic science to advance far enough to reveal what investigators could not. Christine's brother carried a private theory through all of it, quietly, for decades, that whoever did this had not been a stranger, but someone who knew the family well enough to know exactly when their father would be in jail, and exactly when Christine would be home alone. He never had a name to attach to that theory. He simply carried it, year after year, through birthdays that kept arriving without her, through a childhood he finished, and an adulthood he built while that unanswered question sat underneath everything, through his own life moving forward in a way his sisters never got to. He had been right, that it was someone close, not a stranger. According to her brother's account, Hoover knew the family's schedule through his and his wife's work connection to her father. Janet had called their home that same morning before leaving to visit him in jail. It took the system 36 years to catch up to what her brother had believed almost from the start. What happens when science finally catches up to a case that time had already left behind? The break came from genetic genealogy, a method that traces crime scene DNA through public family tree databases, cross-referencing genetic material against relatives who had voluntarily uploaded their own DNA for entirely unrelated reasons. Birthday gifts and ancestry curiosity turned, decades later, into an investigative tool nobody could have imagined when Christine disappeared. It was a tool that did not meaningfully exist for most of the years this case sat unsolved, and it would not exist in any usable form until long after Janet and Bob Jessop had spent a quarter-century without an answer. Investigators applied it to the same biological evidence that had cleared Morin decades earlier. On October 9, 2020, they finally had a name. His name was Calvin Hoover, 28 years old in 1984, a close family friend and her father's coworker, not a stranger passing through Queensville. Christine had visited the Hoover home just days before she disappeared. He was not on any list of suspects in 1985. He was never surveilled the way Guy Paul Morin was surveilled. He was never sat down and interviewed the way Morin was interviewed. He simply continued on, entirely undisturbed, while an innocent neighbor absorbed every ounce of suspicion that should have belonged somewhere else. For the first time in 36 years, investigators could finally stop asking who had done this. They had spent decades searching, in one form or another, for a stranger. Instead, the answer had been someone who had been part of the family's circle all along. He had died 5 years before police even knew his name. Toronto police made the identification public on October 15, 2020, 36 years and 12 days after Christine climbed off that school bus carrying her recorder. There was no trial, no verdict. No moment where Janet and Bob Jessop sat in a courtroom gallery and watched a jury say the word guilty. Calvin Hoover was never punished, by any court, in any way. He simply died in obscurity, having gotten away with it for the rest of his natural life, while an innocent man spent a decade fighting to prove he had not done what Hoover actually did. Christine never got a 10th birthday, never finished that school year, never got to hand that recorder back at the end of the semester. Guy Paul Morin never got back the years a stubborn, tunnel-visioned investigation took from him. Years he spent first in a courtroom and then in a cell for a crime he had nothing to do with. And Calvin Hoover got every ordinary day this story denied both of them. For 36 uninterrupted years, birthdays and holidays and unremarkable Tuesdays that neither Christine nor Morin ever got to have. Because once investigators convinced themselves they had the right man, they stopped looking for the real one. If there is a single lesson buried inside this case, it is this. An investigation that moves fast is not the same as an investigation that moves correctly. One innocent man lost 10 years of his life to a system that would not admit it had made a mistake. One little girl never made it home from school. And the man investigators never seriously questioned lived another 36 years. That is the cost of getting the wrong answer. Cases like Christine Jessop's deserve to be remembered, not just for what happened, but for what they changed. If you found this documentary valuable, please consider subscribing. It helps more people discover these stories. What stayed with you most about this case? Christine's story, Guy Paul Morin's wrongful conviction, or the fact that the real killer was never identified until after his death? I would really like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching.